Hannah's our sweetest new little angel and our first little girl grandbaby. So life is good, and it's been a lot about the kind of circle of life for us this year. To get into things that are more related to the work of the church explicitly, I guess, and I'm going to talk about this whole deal quite a bit, actually for about a half an hour with its own section tomorrow. If you've heard people talk about the new vision in the North Carolina Synod, just so you know that when I came on board, and even up until this year, the North Carolina Synod had the same vision, the same mission statement that started in 1998. Well, if you kind of look back, that's when Bishop Bolick started, and he served for 18 years. I dare say the church is a little different now than it was in 1998. We've been through a lot together. There are all kinds of different priorities. There are a lot of different personalities and people working in the North Carolina Synod in congregations and on the Synod staff. But just so you know, we align with the three major priorities that, at least for the first time I've been in the Conference of Bishops, that the church-wide organization, the Conference of Bishops, and pretty well our synodical expression of the church all pretty well agree on as the most important thing. Congregational vitality, whole and healthy leaders are those two things that all of those organizations very much lift up as the most important. Collaboration, and again, I'll say more tomorrow, we almost hated to put that one in there, but we realized that even though Synod means we're walking together, a lot of times we're not. We're certainly not doing it in a maximal sort of a way to help the cause of the gospel, and so we want to help enhance that. And prophetic voice, which I've written some things about. It means a lot of things. Again, I will talk about this tomorrow, but I wanted to go ahead and just put that out there, and you'll be receiving a little booklet with not only the vision, but some strategies in it that we started putting together. Some of you will recall that last year we had 3 full-time staff people retire. We also brought on board several new people, and we thought, now is time. We got to figure out who we are, who we need to be moving forward. So got this... Nimble is my favorite word. The Conference of Bishops is really getting annoyed with me, I think, perhaps, with some justification. But we get bogged down in all sorts of things, and I understand systems and processes. But I really do believe that the church is called to be finding ways to be more nimble, to respond more quickly in things that we have quite a number of places, and any organization can get this way, but they become mutually exclusive. Things like the assignment process. There's some great reasons we have it the way we have it, but there are also a lot of people's lives that kind of get messed up by it, and it's not consistent, and some people do one thing and some people do another thing, and we're trying to be less tied to real strict ways of doing things, and still be in communication with each other about how we might be nimble. Holy innovations is something that you may have heard of, but it started out as a conversation at the church-wide level called holy experiments. But a number of the communities in which these were happening didn't necessarily want to feel like guinea pigs and that they were being experimented on. But innovations, ways that when we don't know how, for instance, in church developments, church plants, or in parish arrangements or agreements, or in any number of things that we might look at, in these holy innovations, taking some risk, putting ourselves out there, looking at congregational parish models. A lot of this is not new to the church in general, but it's new again to the North Carolina Synod. Yoking congregations and how we share a pastor in congregations that can't afford a full-time pastor, part-time pastors, lay preaching certifications, so that we can cover who we are. The Holy Innovations, we got a grant for $62,000 from the ELCA that we're working on, and that's under Danielle Denise, our Director of Evangelical Mission. We're excited about that and moving forward. Stewardship for all seasons was alluded to. I think that we had probably in the first couple of years somewhere in the 20-22 range. We got 20 this year in the cohort that just began. It really has been a wondrous program in Stewardship for all seasons. It doesn't really mean that it's stewardship for the summer, fall, winter, spring, although it could mean that, but for all seasons of life. It's about plan giving, it's about current giving, and how we share. Number of synods are using this. Our synod council actually called Mike Ward, who is a pastor, but to work not just with our synod, but with a number of other synods in this program. We've had some really good results for the folks that have worked with Stewardship for all seasons, like $45,000 increases, $100,000 increases, and some things like that in their annual giving. And so we want to continue to lift that up. I have visited a number of places, even with call process, where the call folks will say, well, we need somebody who's not going to talk about money. I'm like, well, what are you going to do with year C? Because that's Luke, and that's about all Jesus talks about is money in Luke. Yeah, you can't do that. You can't not talk about money. Money is not the deal. Money is not the be-all and the end-all. But if our life in Christ is servanthood, called to be servants, then our money becomes stored servanthood, and our life as the church together, and life as individuals is to manage that stored servanthood and to release it as God calls us to discern to do that. We have to talk about that. It's just part of the way that we all are. I want to talk about the landscape of the North Carolina Synod. That's a bit of a sobering statistic that we just looked at. Some of you have heard me say before that we had a congregation say, well, we want a pastor under 30. And this was 2 years ago, and I said, well, I happen to know that our son is 30, and he is the youngest person in the North Carolina Synod. In other words, we don't have any pastors in the North Carolina Synod 2 years ago, under 2.5 years ago, under 30. That has changed a good bit. This statistic would have been much more sobering 2 years ago. 44 pastors between 25 and 40 years of age. 189 pastors between 55 and 70 years of age. If you study trends, you don't really have to be a statistician to understand that this is going to be a really, really big deal, that we have lots and lots of people retiring. We have 18 people serving under call, pastors, in the North Carolina Synod right now who are over 65. So that the next 5 to 10 years are going to get very interesting in terms of availability of clergy folk. So even now, as you begin to talk about, you've got camps and everything coming up, and you've got counselors coming. Don't just approach those folks and say, "Hey, have you ever thought about a vocation in the church?" Let us know in the North Carolina Synod, because we want to reach out to them. We did something on our annual report to Bishop this year where we asked rostered ministers to please tell us if they have people in their congregation who might be good folks to tap, to consider a vocation in the life of the church. And lots of people responded to that. We reach out to those folks. One of the names we got was a 9-year-old, and they said, "Don't call them just yet." I said, "But hang with that. Can I talk to your mother, please?" This is not meant to be depressing. It's just the way that it is, and it affects all kinds of things, including the call process. And I wanted to talk about that a bit because it's a big part of what we do on an ongoing basis. Right now is a very interesting time for us because actually interviewing for a new pastor in the North Carolina Synod, there are 7 congregations. 2 years ago at this time, there were 27 congregations. And so there's that ebb and flow that is happening there. So there aren't that many vacancies in North Carolina right now. There's a new wave coming where we've had some resignations, some retirements, and some things like that, but they're just in the study process and they're not interviewing yet. Term calls. How many folks here have a term call in your congregation, or if you even know about it? Yeah, quite a number. We have 9 people that I'm aware of serving under a term call in the North Carolina Synod right now. In very crass kind of terms, it's sort of a rent-to-own model, where on both sides, because one of the things that we hear is that the call process takes a very, very long time, and it really does in a number of cases. But it's a mutual process, and sometimes an individual doesn't know if they want to commit to serving that congregation, as a rostered minister, but they're willing to sort of be an interim, but an interim that you could keep, because normally the interim contract says you can't keep that person. And a term call is often a 2-year call, and it has a beginning time and an ending time, and toward the end of it, you sit down and mutually discern if that person currently there is going to be your primary candidate. What you can't do with a term call is say, well, yes, we want this one, but send us some other names too. Nope. You got to decide if you want that one as your primary candidate, and if you don't, they move along, and then you get other names. But it's worked actually fairly well for us in a number of cases, particularly, I guess, in an on-demand culture, I call it, where a year and a half of a vacancy or 2 years seems like forever, and a number of people are just gone. They're just done because that's too long for them to consider. Part-time pastors and deacons, I think we also have 9 of those serving last time I counted, and I think we'll see that increasing with both bivocational, which means you feel called really to 2 different ministries. You feel like God's calling you to 2 different things at the same time, which is different from tent-making ministry, where you really feel called to be a rostered minister in the church, but you can't find a call that will sustain and support you and your family and have health care and benefits and retirement and all of that. And so you have a tent-making job that helps provide some of those things, but then you work part-time in the church. Another thing that's new in the call process in the last couple of years is we bring you names. We make an extra visit in the call process from the Synod staff, and we actually come physically and hand you actually pieces of paper rather than just electronic things, and talk to you about those candidates. We have, not counting the term calls, we have moved the average vacancy down from 17 months to about 13 months. That's still too long. We're trying to find that sweet spot when we're really discerning well who it is our next pastor is going to be, but also trying to move the process along as best we can with small things like the end of May and the beginning of June now are getting really, really packed, because we were realizing that if you don't get your congregational study done, by the early June, then you're going to miss July and August because people aren't around, and then you got to wait till September, and then that's going to add another 2 to 3 months, and so we're trying to just be aware of that. Number 5, another thing that we're doing with first call candidates that we just started doing, a number of synods have been doing this for years, that is the synod office staff, namely Michael Denise, helps with the compensation conversations, particularly in a case where it's a very young person who's never been in a call situation before, and because it's more money than they've ever been offered before, and it sounds really good to them, and they're panicking about having to be out of seminary housing, they just say, okay. And we've also noticed that sometimes the congregations don't understand all of the things that go into the portico formulas and so forth. And so it's not just for the rostered minister's sake, but for the congregation's sake, to help broker that conversation. We're happy to do that, and I think it's been helpful. And then I already told you, 27 congregations 2 years ago, and right now 7. So that's in flux. That's always a moving target, but we want to do the best we can possibly do with the call process. Interims. That landscape has changed a lot. I already mentioned term calls, so I won't belabor that, but in our constitutions it says, number 2, that the bishop appoints an interim in consultation with the congregation council. I simply say that, and I think it's helpful to say it out loud here. Most of you are not in a vacancy right now, but if you are, and when you are, please understand that it would be nice to talk to you before you send us the contract of who you hired as your interim, because I'm responsible for that, whether that occurred to you or not. I'm responsible for the pastoral care and the worship of that congregation by constitution, and so it's done together. You don't have to contract with anybody you don't want to, but we're supposed to make that appointment. And it could well be that the person that you hired, we were going to ask to do somewhere else because we knew way before you did who was moving, and that sort of thing. It's kind of interesting when we talk about interims because we use that term loosely. There are several that have been serving 15 years or more in the same place. An interim from what? I mean, that's like longer than the tenure of most regular calls. I understand those situations, and sometimes it's mutually beneficial. Let me tell you what's happening with this wave of lots of pastors my age and older, and not so many pastors coming along. The people that are retiring now, I would say a majority of them are pretty clear with me, I'm not doing any interims. So when we get to another, right now we're good because we only have 7 of these vacancies. But when we get to another time when we have 27, and we will, or 30, we don't have enough interims to go around. And that's an interesting constitutional dilemma when I'm required to appoint someone and we don't have people. So we might even have to share interims in some places. And I'm not trying to put a guilt trip on retiring rostered ministers, but I'm just kind of trying to help you understand the landscape. We don't have as many of those available as we once did. I also have quite a number of congregations that seem to, when we appoint an interim, they want them to preach at least 3 times before they decide. Well, here's the thing. For a regular call, the congregation doesn't hear their regular pastor preach. That was 30 years ago. That doesn't happen anymore. You do not want to call somebody based on a sermon. Everybody has a bad day, and the worst preacher I know had a good day sometime. So, I mean, honestly, you know, and what happens in the old model is you go and you preach a sermon on Sunday morning, which is your trial sermon or call sermon or whatever, and then everybody votes, and what they're voting on is whether they liked your sermon. Not whether it was a good and faithful sermon even, but whether they liked it. Based on what? Did it make them feel good? Depending on what the text was, were they supposed to be feeling good at the end of that text if it was a good and faithful? You get my point. So if we're not doing that in the regular, now the call committee does go hear people preach, but not in the congregation where they're going to be voted on. So that does happen on the call committee level. But if we're not doing that in the regular call process, you don't need to hear your interim preach 3 times before you decide. So sometimes we have an interim shortage for sure. Women in ministry. I wanted to talk about this just for a moment. This is from the Episcopal Church, Christ Episcopal Church, 84th and Broadway in New York. Where do women stand? The altar, the font, the pulpit. I mentioned this a couple of years ago, that the dilemma of congregations that tell us we really don't want a woman. Or sometimes, and I've been told this more than once, we'd like to consider a woman because we don't have as much money to pay. You know, like in most vocations, it's true in the clergy vocation that on average, females are paid less money. It's not right, it's not good. If it's your opinion, that's okay, but I do believe that we've confused a few things in this church, and I just need to say some things, maybe more than you even need to hear them. When we came up with this whole idea when talking about sexuality, about bound conscience, and that congregations who choose to do so in blessing same-gender, now marrying same-gender relationships, there were several different positions that were considered faithful positions of the church in that issue. That does not apply to race and gender in this church. In fact, this church is of one mind about gender equality, about racial equality. And from our standpoint, even though we're very congregational in our call process, and ultimately you call folks, we're going to call you on that. And we have been, we will. If a call committee says we don't want any women, we will require a letter from the council attesting to that that's a congregational decision. And if they also, because what we found is often the call committee itself doesn't even think that. There's one bully on the call committee that is running the deal. And so we are of one mind. We had a seminarian who shared with us that another seminarian said he didn't believe women ought to be pastors, ought not be allowed to be pastors. That would be grounds for not being approved in the ELCA in candidacy. And God loves you. I mean, we followed this up with the secretary of the ELCA, with our candidacy manager, and it was very clear that we're coming up on 50 years, and that's just like a deal. And so we're also gathering, we're in the process of something quite new that started in our staff retreat, talking about women in ministry, particularly the low reality of women in senior pastor type multi-staff positions. And why is that? And kind of the dearth of what seemed to be available candidates for us that would come to the top in the call process and say, wait a minute, why don't, and even a call committee one time asked me, how come you didn't bring us any women's names? And I'm like, yeah, why didn't I? Why don't we have those? Where are they? How do we groom those folks? So so these conversations are still going on, and frankly, they're still going on. I think they're going on more now in our cultural context, things about gender, things about race, than they were 5 years ago. And maybe that's good, because it keeps things from being hidden and festering under the surface. But we need to be talking about the frustrations, the systemic problems. I would remind you that we have a phenomenal bishop, presiding bishop, Elizabeth Eaton, who announced to our Conference of Bishops in March that she would be available for re-election in 2019. And I'm so very grateful for her. And we also have had, to my knowledge, 6 bishop elections before this weekend in the ELCA. 5 of those 6 bishop elections, women were elected. So I don't want to belabor this point, but want to let you know, and 2 of them were African American women, and 3 of them were brand new bishops. And so interesting and challenging. And we'll continue to pull together various women on our roster in the Synod to talk about how that we can do better. Just want to share a word, too, about just the whole context of racism and any other kind of ism that is out there. One of the things, refugee-ism or nationalism or supremacy, or words that just seem to be kind of like a nightmare that you thought you woke up from, but now you're having it again. And I don't know how much of that is news, but I know that it's still real. It's real, I know, in me. I think it's in each one of us. But we're going to be, especially in our justice and advocacy ministry, looking to talk about ways that we can be a voice. Advocacy means advocare, to speak for those who don't have a voice or who don't have much voice. They don't have much power. And it seems to me not a conservative liberal thing in a political sense, certainly not a Republican Democrat thing. Most of my life I've been a Republican. But it seems to me to be a Jesus thing, a pretty clear Jesus reality of caring for those who are on the margins. And so we will be emphasizing that quite a bit. This is from the Act Now to End Racism rally, where we took a busload of folks from the North Carolina Synod. Thanks, Joreen, for helping put that all together. That was the week right after Easter. This is Bishop Bill Gohl in Delaware, Maryland Synod, and standing in front of the Washington Monument. The mall is huge, right? So it seemed kind of empty, but I think we had like 7,000 people there, I think is what I heard. There were not from North Carolina. There were like 40 people there from North Carolina Synod. But to continue to speak out against those places where folks are being marginalized, because the gospel says to, again, the politics play out, but we're speaking from a gospel place. Dr. Mindy talked to you a little bit. The symbol for ecumenism comes from the word like oikos, which means house, like being in the same house together. The cross of Christ above the boat. We're looking toward being very intentional, particularly renewing relationship with the Roman Catholic Church, which came apart over Amendment 1 back in 2010, if anybody remembers that. Again, same gender marriage issues. The Episcopal Church, in many ways, it seems our fates are going to be tied together in small towns and in rural places that have a Lutheran and an Episcopal Church. It just seems like that's going to be the way, and maybe even in mission starts and redevelopments, that's going to be a really, really big deal. Working with Moravians and with the AME Zion, they're not a full communion partner. We still are having logistical trouble, but we did get a Michael Peeler, Virginia Casey grant with the Ecumenical Relations Committee to pull together 15 pairings of pastors, AME Zion pastor, ELCA pastor from the same town, and we are constrained, and we apologize, working from Charlotte to Raleigh because that's Bishop Battle's territory, and their synod is not the same as ours. Their district is not the same as ours. And we will have 3 retreats with those pastors and work toward keeping them accountable to bring their congregations together in various ways. Bishop Battle suggested to me at Bold Like Jesus in front of the gang, and I thought he had a really good point. He said, before you try to make too much of a deal of how many black people you have in the North Carolina Synod, why don't you just sit down and talk to some black people first, rather than making us numbers or some kind of colonial. And I'm like, right, you're right, ouch, but you're right. So that's what we're trying to do, and so we're working on that. Quickly, just wanted to give a shout out to something that I've not talked about in the 3 years that I've been here, and that is military chaplaincy. I spent, along with Bishop Bob Humphrey, at 3 days at Fort Bragg with, and this is Major General Hurley, who's the Chief of Chaplains of the Army, which includes the Reserves and the National Guard. And I was really not prepared to be as inspired as I was there. What is it we talk about all the time in the life of the church? What do we lament? That our lack of diversity, and that where are the young people? In the military, you got incredibly diverse population of almost all young people, and they're assigned, whether they ask for one or want one or not, a chaplain with whom they spend significant time and who deploy with them. So they're experiencing a real shortage in all of the military branches, but particularly the Army right now in chaplaincy. There are some age restrictions, like you got to start before you're 42. If you don't start before you're 42, you can't get in. And you got to pass certain physical ability sorts of things. But whether it's, and I know we have a lot of reserve folks here and some actively serving folks here, who are here even at this at Synod Assembly, and thank you for doing that, by the way. Would you stand up if you're serving in the reserves or in the active duty? We really do appreciate you, and when we talk about going to be the church in the world, I actually can't think of a better place to reach diversity in young people. That's like the deal. It's 400 people, 400 soldiers, a chaplain. That's how it works in the Army anyway. Lastly, and I will hush, our what had fallen by the wayside, not really for any fault so much even of ours, but just of severe changes in the global churches, with some changes in the Lutheran Church in Costa Rica, which has a total of about 500 members in the whole country. About 16 congregations. We've renewed a lot of relationships with that church and are continuing to do so. And in fact, our offering, one of our offerings, can't remember when. The one this morning, yeah. We are working with Southwest Texas, who's also their companion synod, to sponsor a pastor there. They had an unfortunate misconduct situation that removed 2 of their 9 rostered people in the whole country. And so we sent a pastor down there who speaks Spanish, and we're paying for her. We just said we'll find a way to pay for her to be there for at least a year, and then we'll talk about what happens next. Then the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Papua New Guinea, they have a new bishop who visited with us not long ago. When was that? 2 years ago? Yeah, that was 2 years ago. Jack Urama, and we are partners with the Yabim district. We are in the process of planning a trip for the spring of 2019 with the 4 synods of the ELCA that have companion relationships in Papua New Guinea. It would be, they've asked the bishop, one of the bishop's assistants, and one other person to come. And I think that we're sort of ready to begin to renew those relationships of accompaniment, kind of getting away from, again, sort of an old colonial model where we send you money and we teach you how to be the church. That's not who we need to be. But those are the priorities that we're working on right now. And I'm going to talk to you tomorrow again about the vision piece, just the vision piece about what we do moving forward. But that's my recap. It's my story. I'm sticking to it, and I'm done.